There are some relationships that we don't just remember, we actually mythologize them. We turn them into symbols, we smooth over the edges, and we tell ourselves this cleaner version of the story than what was actually probably happening. John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette Kennedy are one of those couples, and I think part of why they stay with people, and certainly why they stay with me, isn't just because of how they looked or even how they died, but it's because something in their relationship feels unresolved to us. Like we never really got to understand what was actually happening between them. So that's what I want to do today. I'm not going to retell the story the way it's usually told, but I want to look at it clinically through attachment, through systems, and through the psychology of identity formation, regulation, and relational dynamics. But before we get into that, my name is Connie Pearl. I'm a psychologist in training, and I've spent the last 15 years studying relationships, trauma, and human behavior across clinical psychology, attachment theory, CBT, psychodynamic, and systems frameworks. And what I've realized over and over again is that people don't actually understand relationships. Not really. We understand feelings, stories, even chemistry, but we don't understand the underlying systems that are actually driving our behavior in relationships. And that, in essence, is my mission, to help you understand yourself and your significant others better. Because if you don't understand what's actually happening, you can't change it, you can't choose differently, and you can't build something better. So this podcast is a space where we slow things down. Sometimes we'll look at real relationships, sometimes it'll be cultural dynamics, and even case studies like this one from celebrity culture, but always through a psychological lens. Because relationship health, not just love, but healthy love, is at the core of everything I care about. And it's actually been proven scientifically, especially from Harvard's 2023 longitudinal study, that relationships are what determine the quality of your life more than anything else. Who you choose, how you attach, what you tolerate, what you avoid. So whether you're here because you're curious about this couple or you want to get better at relationships yourself, I'm so glad you're here. So let's start with him, John F. Kennedy Jr. He's born into one of the most powerful families in the world. And I think that's important, not just as a fact of history, but psychologically, because from the moment that he's born, he doesn't get to be a child. He's already carrying, infused with this meaning that we are all attributing to him. There's that image. It's the one that everyone knows of him saluting his father's casket at 3 years old. And I always come back to that moment when I think about him, because we have to consider, what does that actually do to a nervous system, to a child? To be grieving at 3 years old and simultaneously being watched by the whole world. From a developmental and attachment perspective, that's not really neutral, that's kind of formative. And it's a moment where emotion becomes something that is not just felt, but that is performed, right? It's regulated externally. It's witnessed publicly. And then his life continues in that direction. He grows up with immense privilege and profound loss at the same time. And those two things together create a very specific kind of psychological environment. On one hand, he has great access to opportunity and admiration, but on the other, there is this grief and pressure and expectation that weighs heavy. Now, layer onto that the fact that, according to reports, he struggled academically. There are claims that he was diagnosed with ADD and dyslexia and was prescribed Ritalin. And as we know, he failed the bar exam multiple times. Now, the academic failure is not really the most interesting part to me. Academia has failed so many of our most talented, smartest people, so that's not something we really need to zero in on so much, but rather, like a psychologist would, we together are looking for clues, and his failure is a clue that leads us to something important. It's not about his academic struggle, but rather it's about what it represents for him specifically in his clinical presentation. If you are someone whose identity is tied to legacy, to intelligence, to being a Kennedy, then struggling cognitively and academically, it's not just frustrating, it's quite destabilizing for someone. From a clinical perspective, ADHD, if that diagnosis is accurate, and I do suspect that it is not just about attention deficit, it's also about regulation, emotional regulation, impulse control, sustained focus under pressure, the ability to judge. And I find myself wondering, This is where I'll stay a bit tentative because, again, we're working with limited data. But what happens when someone with those vulnerabilities is placed inside a system that demands near perfection from him, from his performance? Does that person overcompensate? Do they seek environments where they feel more in control? Do they gravitate towards intensity because that intensity is easier to track than stability, perhaps? Now, I don't have a clean answer to that, but I think the question itself is important to ask, and it's important we think and fantasize about what his life might have been like. Now for Carolyn. Carolyn Bessette came from a very different world, not political royalty, and not raised with that same level of scrutiny. She worked in fashion, she worked for Calvin Klein, and everything about her presentation, at least publicly, suggests something very different from JFK Jr. She's controlled, she's private. There's a kind of emotional containment to her. And again, I want to be careful not to over-pathologize, but from an attachment perspective, when we see that level of control and privacy, we often think of, maybe an avoidant strategy where closeness is overwhelming to her. Maybe autonomy is prioritized over other things in her life, and her emotional exposure is very likely limited. So now we have these two people, one raised in exposure and one oriented towards privacy. And then the media, the culture calls it a perfect match in the tabloids because of their beauty together. And I'm not so sure it is. I think sometimes what we actually assume is compatibility is really just sort of chemistry, but layered with difference that eventually pops up in the relationship later on. Difference can be very activating. It's very compelling, but it's not always regulating in relationships. And I think sometimes that compatibility, is actually just a mutual fascination. And fascination carries the relationship for a while, right? But it doesn't regulate it. What starts to happen, and we see this clinically all the time, is that difference becomes a stressor in relationships. Not immediately, not at the beginning of the relationship. At first, it's exciting. You're drawn to the other person because they have what you don't. And they feel grounding, or maybe they feel expansive. Maybe it's calming, or maybe it's like really electric. But over time, those differences between you begin to start feeling like friction in your relationship. And this is where it's important to bring in kind of an EFT lens, emotionally focused therapy, because if you strip away the glamour and the media and the mythology of this couple, what you find is that relationships like this usually represent a very classic pursuer-distancer dynamic. One partner will move toward while the other partner moves away, and it's not necessarily a conscious dance. It's not malicious. It's just something that is kind of regulatory to the couple in some way. The pursuer is trying to close the distance, and the distancer is trying to manage the overwhelm happening. And the more one moves one way, the more the other reacts. So if we imagine, again, tentatively imagining JFK Jr. as someone who is more externally oriented, more socially embedded, more comfortable being seen, and then Carolyn as someone who's more internally regulated, she's more private and controlled, we can start to see how that dynamic between them might emerge. He reaches for her and she pulls back, and he experiences it as distance, and she experiences it as his reaching is like a pressure that is too much for her. And now we're in the loop of what we have kind of seen play out in the tabloids for this couple. What's important clinically is that both people feel like they are responding appropriately. He's thinking, I'm trying to connect. And she's thinking, I need to breathe, I need space, I need autonomy. Neither one is necessarily wrong, but the system that they're in together is now dysregulating. And that's why they began having so many problems. Now, Sue Johnson talks about this in EFT therapy, that conflict is not really about the content. It's about the attachment panic that's happening. And that's something that we miss culturally when we talk about this couple. We look at relationships like this and we focus on did they fight? Were they happy? Were they compatible? But clinically, the more relevant question we should ask is, how did they regulate each other? What was the dance that they did? What was their pattern and where was it going wrong? Love, in a sustainable sense, is not just about attraction. It's about whether those two nervous systems can find some kind of rhythm together. And I'm not so sure theirs were or that theirs could. And we have to add something else to the system because this relationship was not dyadic. It was not just two people. It was two people inside of a system, a very loud and very intrusive system. The media, public perception, and cultural projection. And I don't think we can accurately understand how destabilizing that was for their relationship and probably for Carolyn. Because now it's not just how do I feel in this relationship? How do I feel with my partner? It's how do I feel in this relationship while being watched and interpreted and scrutinized by millions of people. From a systems perspective, that introduces this third force into the relationship, this constant, ever-present observer. And observers change our behavior. We know this from psychological studies. You start performing, even subtly, you become aware of how things look and you edit yourself, you manage perception, and over time that creates a bit of a split between the private relationship and the one that is shown in public. And I think, again, tentatively thinking, I think that Carolyn probably felt that. There are reports that she was deeply uncomfortable with, the level of attention that their couple was getting. She felt exposed. She struggled a lot with the paparazzi. And it makes sense because if your baseline regulatory system is privacy and your environment removes that completely, you don't just feel uncomfortable anymore. You feel totally unsafe. And then your partner, the person who is supposed to be your primary attachment figure, is someone who is so deeply embedded in that system. In some ways, he also benefits from it, right? He almost enjoys it. That's really complicated because now it's not just you versus the world. It's like you, your partner, and the world, and you're not really all on the same side of it. Now, there's something that I really keep coming back to when I think about JFK in particular, and it's almost psychodynamic in nature. JFK was not just a person. He was a symbol. And when you're in relationship with someone who is a symbol, you're not just relating to them, you're relating to what they represent. History, legacy, expectation, fantasy. And I think that kind of creates a distortion in the relationship because you can't fully see the person in front of you. You're relating to the image, you're trying to live up to it, and it's exhausting on both sides. It's exhausting. He has to be the Kennedy, and she has to be the woman who fits beside that. And I do find myself wondering how much space was there for either of them to actually be themselves in the relationship, to be a little messy, to be insecure, to not really know what they're doing and to figure it out, because that's what real relationships require. And where that space doesn't exist, people start to fracture internally. You split. You split into a version of yourself that's presented and the version that's struggling. If those two versions get too far apart, something usually gives. I also want to briefly come back to the ADHD piece of all this, because I think it's easy to dismiss as a side detail, but clinically, it's really not. If JFK Jr. did struggle with attention regulation, impulse control, and sensation seeking, that has relational implications. That means something for their relationship. ADHD is associated with difficulty and sustained attention, emotional reactivity, impulsivity, a need for stimulation. And I'm not making any definitive claims here, but I am thinking about the patterns that we saw through their relationship. When you combine a dysregulated internal system with high external pressure, a relationship that's already strained, you don't get stability. You get a really intense, volatile environment. And even something like piloting a plane, which requires sustained attention, regulation, and precision, takes on a different meaning in the context of an ADHD diagnosis. Now, I'm not saying the ADHD caused anything, but I am saying these factors do not exist in isolation. They all interact as part of a system. There's another tension to bring up here that's worth naming because it shows up in a lot of relationships. There's a difference between desire and sustainability in love. Desire often thrives in mystery and indifference. And, for Carolyn, in many ways, she embodied that. She was very hard to read. She was hard to access. She was very contained, at least from the outside looking in. Those are the qualities that create desire, but they're not always the same qualities that create safety in a relationship. Without safety in a relationship, you can't build something stable. And this is where people often get confused in their love life. They think if it feels intense, it must be right. It must be love if it's this magnetic. But intensity and regulation in a relationship are not the same thing. And chemistry is not the same thing as compatibility. Sometimes what draws you to someone is the very thing that will make the relationship difficult to sustain. So what do we do with all of this information? Because it's easy for us to sit there and think, oh, well, they're a super famous couple. It's a different world for them, but it's really not. We see these relational dynamics everywhere. The pursuer who feels like they're always reaching forward, the distancer who feels like they're being asked for more than they can give. There's one person trying to live up to some kind of identity, maybe a familial legacy, instead of actually being completely genuine in themselves. And there's relationships that look perfect on the outside that feel really misaligned from the inside. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is learn how to see those patterns clearly in our own lives and in our own relationships, not to judge them or pathologize them, but to understand them. Because once you see the system you're in, you have a chance of changing it for something that you actually want. You can ask, how am I moving? Am I moving forward or am I moving away? Am I asking for connection or am I protecting myself from overwhelm? Am I relating to my partner or am I relating to what they represent? And those questions, when asked properly, really start to shift things. I don't think that JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette were a fairy tale. I think they were two people with a very real psychological pattern in their couple and very real psychological patterns in themselves, trying to love each other inside a system that made it incredibly difficult for them to do so. And I think what stays with people is not just their beauty, it's that tension. It's that tension that feels familiar to all of us too. The sense that something was there, but it wasn't working. What a universal experience for all of us in relationships. And we don't always like to sit with that. We don't like to think about that. It challenges our idea of love as this beautiful, magnetic, easy thing. But clinically, love is not enough. Regulation matters. Attachment matters. Environment matters. Identity matters. And how all of these things intersect in the system matter a lot. When those things aren't aligned in your relational system, even the most compelling relationships with the most chemistry and beauty can still struggle too. Episodes of Connie Pearl Psychology are released every month. Subscribe to my Substack, conniepearlpsychology.substack.com, to have each one delivered straight to your inbox. And if you're ready to go deeper, join Velvet, the world's first relationship intelligence platform, at velvetapp.ai, where you can optimize your relationships. Loving smarter has never been so easy.